I just want to go back to what Dan said about needing a fighting grassroots union and sort of what the need is for that and how we can link that to the broader community and how we can get that support from the broader community by looking at a very specific case. So in this period where we have, Trump and appointing Betsy DeVos, who is looking to further segregate schools, privatize, et cetera, we're also looking at an era in which certain levels of socialist ideas are becoming more acceptable. They're going against these privatization attacks. And so I think one of the ways that we need to look at our union is connecting it to the broader community and making it a union that is more active against racism in our schools and against school segregation. And right now, currently, we have a situation where an anti-racist principal is under attack, and teachers on that staff as well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how that relates to the union that we need. So while we have this increase in right-wing attacks in this country, something that isn't new or that has been increasing steadily for years is school segregation, which has been on the uptick since the late 80s and early 90s. So I'm going to do a couple of stats. So very often people tend to blow off school segregation as, well, it's neighborhood segregation, right? It's the geography of the city. But actually we've seen in studies, like the most recent one I could actually find that directly related to this was 2009 to 2010, and about 650 of the 1,700 schools in the system have populations that were 70% a single race. And more than half the city schools were at least 90% Black and Latino. So, and then we also found that the city schools are in fact more racially segregated than the neighborhoods themselves. So that kind of blows apart that idea that, well, this is just, it's because the schools are in neighborhoods and the neighborhoods are segregated. And then we had school choice, which came in with Bloomberg, which allowed students to apply to high schools outside of their community. But I can't remember how many years in we are, maybe 15 years in on that system. Black and Latino students are just as isolated, and the schools are just as segregated in high schools as the elementary schools are. So that choice program also did nothing to help with school segregation. So one of the sort of a recent microcosm in the way that school segregation works, and so this is happening in a neighborhood that I was born in the 70s, which has progressively gentrified over the years. So when I was born there, it was a much more mixed community, and now it's become very sort of high concentration of white people, high concentration of upper middle class members. And so one of the high schools in that community is John Jay High School. And John Jay was split, I believe in the late 90s, early 2000s, into a bunch of smaller schools. And it's always been a building that's had primarily students of color in it. But as the racial composition of the surrounding community changed, there was decreasing support from the community for that school because parents had the option to send their kids elsewhere, given the high school choice program. So this just decreases demands that are going to arise out of the surrounding community for better facilities or for decent facilities in that school. And I have heard for years Park Slope parents talking about how we need to take back that school. That school should be for our children. So one of the plans they came up with was to open a school called Millennium High School. It would have a screened application process that would allow for a lot of flexibility for the school administration to choose the students that they were going to take into that school, and that could then be altered to draw students from Park Slope, from the Park Slope community. So Jill Bloomberg is the principal of Park Slope Collegiate, or PSC, which is one of those small schools within that building, and it's predominantly children of color, like all the other schools in that building. And she had been fighting for repairs. The school's in terrible shape. I think there are pictures online somewhere. And I would go back to the lack of community support and demands for that school to be in better condition, because people aren't invested in a school if their own children are going to it. Sadly, it shouldn't be that way, but that is how it tends to work. And so a school in an affluent community that's serving children of color also is evidence that school segregation is not only based on geographic segregation. Part of the plan to bring in this Millennium Brooklyn High School, was involved money to renovate the building, but this money had been withheld while these other small schools were operating. All of a sudden, Park Slope parents want to open a school, and lo and behold, there's all this money that can be used to renovate the building. And the most disturbing part that I remember from a PDP back in 2011 was that they wanted to set up a separate entrance for the students from Millennium High School that would not have metal detectors, but they were very vehement about metal detectors remaining in the entrance for the other schools. And I mean, I've seen over the years, as the gentrification increased, students are, at the end of the day, the students in that building have been herded onto MTA buses by school security guards. They want them out of the neighborhood. There's a huge, discouraging allowing the students to walk around the neighborhood in which they attend their school. So Joe Bloomberg was very vocal against the Millennium opening, and it was used rightfully so as a platform to discuss school segregation and to discuss the inadequate funding levels that were going on. And she also encouraged students to speak their mind about it, and several did at the Panel for Education policy meeting I was at. And they were extremely aware of, the idea that they were being criminalized, the idea that this was being created to push them out of a neighborhood that didn't want them in that school. And Bloomberg was also very vocal about other racist DOE policies and school segregation. So now she, along with two other teachers who work at the school, are being accused of politically organizing students, using their own personal politics. And really what this is about is telling students that it's okay to advocate for themselves and to advocate for their school, and that's now being targeted as this inappropriate political pushing of adult ideas on children. And so just really briefly, I want to go back to, this is reminiscent of an earlier, from the 50s, battle that was going on when the union, or one of the unions, before the UFT started, there was a union called the TU. It included a lot of members of the Communist Party. Oh, and I forgot to mention, so the political ideas that they're being accused of having is communist ideas, right? This is terrible, the children are learning about communism, and it's the rhetoric is extremely McCarthyist. So that's sort of why I want to go back to the 50s really quickly. So TU included, like I said, many members of the Communist Party of the US. And in 1948, the TU published a pamphlet called The Children's Textbooks. It was formulated by the Harlem Committee of the Teachers Union, and it was discussing anti-racist textbooks. And then later, there was a 1950s pamphlet by the same group within the TU called Bias and Prejudice in Textbooks in Use in New York City Schools. And some of the shockingly racist things that it exposed in the textbooks, a lot of citations that slaves had very happy lives, a lot of references, very unapologetic pro-Klan references. It's to us, it's kind of horrifying, and it exposed it. And wasn't alive in the 50s. I don't know how many people in the community were already aware of these things, but it definitely exposed it. And in the same year, a virulent anti-communist on the school board named George Timon led an ultimately successful battle to ban TU from representing teachers with the school board. And then TU also started a integration campaign in the 50s. So what this sort of brings up is the ways in which anti-racism has been historically pitted against right-wing anti-communism. And so because many of these teachers were fired in the 50s, I'm not looking at this as what the TU or what the CP did as a model for what we need to do, but it really creates a clear picture of the energy and the time that the state is willing to put into rooting anti-racism out of the school system so that they can continue with their agenda. So it just shows how they are just so determined to stomp on anti-racist measures no matter what it takes. And so, but then the case at Park Slope Collegiate also reveals the extent to which they're willing to just, what DOE is willing to do to stomp out this anti-racist sentiment as regards the students themselves. So at PSC, students were hauled in to OSI, the Office of Special Investigation. They were left there by their guidance counselor to speak to 3 3 members of OSI without school supervision. They grilled them about the political activities of their parents, some of whom are teachers in the DOE, and all of the students brought in were young women of color, every single one. No parents were notified. So they're interrogating the kids without parents' permission, without teachers, without administration, without guidance counselors present. This is something they're willing to do even as they're saying, well, these poor children are being exposed to these horrible ideas, but they have no problem themselves victimizing these students, themselves interrogating these students. They're too fragile to be around radical politics, but they're not too fragile to be interrogated in this way. I mean, even at one of the most prestigious high schools in this entire city, students have been banned from walking into the admissions office for requesting transparency in the way that admissions are handled, because they can see the school segregation. So again, we're seeing the lengths to which the state is willing to go in the suppression, and when teachers and school administrators take up anti-racism, it's completely intolerable to them. So the way that this connects to the union that we need is we're going to need a union that fights for these anti-racist policies and protects teachers, because everything is there is no transparency, everything's very shady. We don't actually even know how this investigation is working. We don't know what the UFD is actually doing for these teachers. And I think one of the ways in which we need to look at unions and the way that they're being weakened, and everything that Dan said about how it's hard to convince people to be a part of this, it's also hard to convince people outside of the union to support the union when they don't see the union doing things for their kids. And teachers are uniquely positioned in this way, both to make progress and also to be attacked, because we have strong relationships with our students. They're our kids. You know, these are our kids that we are with every single day, all day. And we also have connections to their families, and that makes us all very dangerous to continuing oppression, especially when you segregate schools by race, class, and income level. These unequal resources lead parents and kids to start to question how much the teachers really care. I mean, if their kids aren't learning enough, and if their kids are not in a safe environment, I mean, who do we blame? It's got to be the fault of the teachers, at least somewhat. That's how they're going to look at it. And so it's very important for the DOE and the larger state to make sure to continue those fissures and to continue broadening that lack of connection between students and teachers, because if we work as a community and we're together fighting for our kids and for our teachers at the same time, we become extremely dangerous. So I think we have to remember that our interests as union members are the same as other working class oppressed people, and we need to be really clear about that. And we need to act accordingly and fight for the rights of union teachers who are fighting for the rights of these children. And the rights of all kids to an integrated school environment that's been proven to create a better educational experience for everyone involved. And the only way that unions can survive, I think it is going to be hard to just communicate to our members the need to survive. We're also going to have to communicate to the broader community the need for the unions in the first place to be able to get that support. I feel like that's the only way that unions can survive, is to maintain these solidarity-based connections with the wider community.
Thanks.